Hi, Paul Thompson here with 5 tips on how to program velocities better. The first tip is don't be too pianistic in your performance. I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. Okay, so excuse the clams, which I'll just remove. So what have we got here? Well, if we look at the velocity profile, if we look at the kind of way I'm playing, it's all over the place. I'm being really pianistic. I'm exaggerating, obviously, kind of for effect, but I've got this kind of really quite violent skew up and down in the dynamic. And it just doesn't sound very realistic when you do this kind of thing on the strings. And to show you, I'm actually going to put a total straight line across and play that. Okay, and while it sounds unmusical like that, it sounds more realistic because you haven't got these kind of gigantic leaps in dynamic that would just not translate to such a large group of players. So what are we going to do to make this better? Well, the first thing we can do is to try and kind of lessen the amount of dynamic variance that we've got here. And we can do that by just kind of flattening this slightly. And if we wanted to, we can then just kind of move that compressed line up and down. Let's see what that sounds like. So again, you'll see that there are a couple of places where the meat and potatoes of the piano, where you can do sudden and dramatic drops from one note to the next in dynamic, like here. That kind of thing just sounds terrible on the strings. So let's go in and start evening a few of those things out. So we can move that one up. Are there any other really dramatic points? Well, maybe let's take this group and move those up a little bit just to even the line out. I would take any outliers that are, again, a function of piano style of performance where you might have, you might be accenting a certain note instinctively on the keyboard. So I'd just even a few of the really big outliers from the chords out so that you end up with a slightly more condensed. And I'm not being really rigid about this because I want it to still sound realistic and slightly human. So what does that sound like? Okay, it's sounding a lot better already. Now, there's something else that you need to think about, and that brings me to tip number 2, which is to think about the instruments idiomatically. Think about how they play and how that might affect the way that you're going to program. So, for example, a common way to play this kind of passage on a stringed instrument would be to use down and up bows. And typically, because we're starting on the beat, you would start with a down bow. That would be the most common thing. You could also do down, 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 up, 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 up. But probably the most natural thing I would imagine a string player to do would be to go down, up, down, up, down, up. Now the down bow is going to sound slightly stronger or fuller than the up bow. And obviously good string players can make this so even that you almost can't tell. But let's say for the purposes of our demonstration here, we're going to make it so that we're getting a nice kind of rhythm to it, and we want the down bow to be slightly more accented. Well, as you can see, these smooth lines that we have here, these are not helping us. So let's take all of the second parts of each couple and let's drop them all. So I'm not pulling them way down. I'm just dropping them relative to the first note in each pair. And if I just look along the line, I can see where there might be a couple of anomalies. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to play it first and see if you can hear where the anomalies lie. So the obvious one is here. Now I know that there's a note missing. Let's pop that note back in. But even with that note, it sounds a bit odd. And what we need to do is we need to just bring this chord back up slightly. And again, you can see that I'm not being rigid about it. I'm dragging them all up roughly to where they should be. Here again, we've got this anomaly here. which is the top note and the second note, and they are just not following this nice gentle pattern that we've established. So as you can hear, it's a really straightforward thing to do, to think about how the instrument plays idiomatically and how that might translate to your velocity programming in this context. Now, how does this compare to woodwind instruments and brass instruments, for example? Well, let's do a similar thing with the clarinet and have a look at that. Now again, if we straight line this, then you can hear that is, although it doesn't have the kind of musical flow to it, it definitely sounds more realistic than the pianistic version that we were just listening to. So what are the problems that are going on here? Well, one of the problems is the overall swell as before, which we will control by doing the same kind of move. We'll just compress the line and then bring it back up a little bit. Let's have a listen to that. Now, there is an element, and again, I know that great musicians work hard and every day to try and eliminate any of these kind of differences in their playing so that they can play as smoothly as possible when they're double tonguing, when they're bowing ups and downs, try to make them sound as close as possible. But there is still something inherently which doesn't sound quite right. I'm going to show you on the clarinet. Now, when you're repeating notes, probably not at this speed, but if you're repeating notes even slightly faster, you would end up with this. And I'm doing ta, ka, ta, ka, ta. Now, as you can hear, I'm a tiny bit rusty, but there is a kind of inconsistency. It doesn't just follow a kind of flow. Now we can use the same kind of trick as before to simulate this by taking the second group of each pair and moving those down slightly in the dynamic. And that would sound like this. Now that's definitely sounding better. It's not too extreme. If we did it too extreme, we'd end up with this, which just doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound realistic. So the answer is to program that slight inconsistency, but also again to look for any kind of outlying signs in the velocity profile that kind of suggest that something's not quite right. And if we go and even those out a tiny, tiny bit, we'll get an even better result. It's about thinking, and especially if we play that faster, then that's going to sound much better than what we originally played in. So again, it's a combination of thinking idiomatically and thinking about not playing pianistically. But what would happen if we were doing something on the trumpet? Now, the trumpet also plays double tongues as ta-ka, ta-ka. Or da-ka, da-ka. It's almost like a d and a g as opposed to a t and a k with different kind of, that gives you a slightly rounder sound. But the key thing that I find very different about the way that the trumpet reacts as opposed to the way that most woodwind react is that it has a more explosive start to the note. And this does really iron out the kind of timbral difference or the dynamic difference between the two different sounds that are producing the double tongue. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm going to demonstrate by playing in something, a kind of typical trumpety part. Okay, so slightly all over the place there. Let's just tighten that up. And we can see an obvious problem area there already. But let's just play that back. Now, if we just put a straight line across that. Now, weirdly, although that sounds unmusical, it kind of sounds more like trumpets. So what's going on here? Well, again, we've got the rule, the tip number 1, which is about the pianistic playing, but we've also got this consideration of what happens when we're double tonguing and what happens idiomatically with the instrument. Now, if we did the same as before and we pulled down the second so that we got the first of each pair accented, what would happen? Weird. Doesn't sound quite right. And the answer and the reason for that is because of the explosive sound of the trumpet and the way that the notes are produced. You don't tend to characteristically get this kind of difference between the notes. They are much more even. So if we go back to our straight line, the way that we might do it is the first note of each passage, and I'm going to just split them up a little bit. The first note of each kind of group would have a stronger accent, and once the airflow, once the kind of the player has nailed the first note, things might settle down a tiny bit. So we might have a tiny bit of a difference here, where I'm just going to make them slightly less even, and I'm going to accent the last note of the group. That sounds like this. Now that sounds better already. Let's put a slightly stronger accent on the second one because we're repeating. So let's have that. And also we'll make sure that the top note is slightly louder. Then we're going to drop things for the semiquavers because there's not quite as much air coming out there. And then we'll put a little bit of a kind of gradual drop down in those. So what does that second group sound like? Now, there's lots of different ways you could do this. We could have a power up towards the end. And here, there is this kind of rise that we argued against before. There is you can do a kind of rise like that because the trumpet is less idiomatically accented on the first of each group. We might even get them to just blast those last 3 notes. And that sounds more realistic again. So it's all about playing with how, picture the sound of the instrument in your head and then try to translate that using your velocity programming to get something as close as that and how you might imagine the trumpet to play. And YouTube, again, is a fantastic resource for watching, especially people teaching an instrument. So if you don't know much about the trumpet, for example, then you can jump on. There's some fantastic stuff on there. There's our own BBC SO video, which shows a huge amount of detail about the trumpet with Martin Hurrell as well. So check out the resources on YouTube. Now, that brings us to our third tip. Whoops, drifting a little bit out of time there towards the end. Let's just pull that all back in. Okay, so as you can see again, my velocities as I played it in, slightly all over the place. Let's just do a straight line and see what that sounds like. Again, it starts to sound a little bit more realistic, but I'm not going to go that way. I'm going to try and alter what we have and keep some of the humanity in the performance there. So let's do again our kind of similar thing of evening out so that we've got down bow, up bow, down bow, up bow. There's a bit of an anomaly here. It drops away a little bit. Then a little bit strong there. That's okay. That's probably jumping out a little bit oddly because it's not, it's the last beat of the bar. That was me thinking about the jump up in the next bar. And then let's just even those out a tiny bit. Sounds like this. Now we could actually exaggerate that by widening that gap and pulling it down again. Widen it a bit, pull it down again. Let's put it about there. Okay, and if we really went to town and really pulled those down, No, that doesn't sound right. So getting too much of a difference there is not good. But what would happen if we tried a different kind of pattern? Well, what about doing something like this, where the third beat is actually below? That sounds like this. Doesn't sound good at all, does it? But we could bring the second note down and then creep back up. So we got the second note right down, and then we're building back up like this. Second note down, build up. Let's see what that sounds like. It's interesting. It still sounds slightly lumpy and weird. Now I'm going to go over to programming on drums, the 16ths, and show you what the difference is here. So again, we're kind of, these are all slightly interlinked, but we're talking about the idiomatic feel of the instrument. And it's actually, you can't really stray too far away from the way that the instrument traditionally plays and the way that a player would play this kind of thing before it just starts to sound wrong, lumpy, etc. However, the rules change slightly when we go to percussion. Right, now we're going to use the BBC Symphony Orchestra Snare 1, and I've gone in for a kind of close sound. Now, if I hover over the key, you can see that these are basically the same hit on C3 and D3. So I'm just going to use that because it's slightly easier to play. And I'm going to play in a 16th pattern. Okay, so let's see what my, let's pull it in a little bit, but let's see what my pattern sounds like. Now, where are the anomalies? Well, first of all, again, our dynamic range is just too wide. But falling away in this manner towards the beat is quite characteristic for drum programming. And let's just even this out slightly. Okay, so you can hear where it's working and where it isn't. That's working. That one is a little bit lumpy. Again, that shape, not quite so good here. We need it to kind of fall away a bit. And again, the growing up shape here. So this is very, very different. We're finding interesting new ways to make shapes. Now, what if we took something like this section and just made the whole pattern all about that? Okay, so what are the options here? We can do a strong 3. Let's see what that sounds like. Sounds lumpy and horrible. We can do a weak 3. Sounds very nice. We can do falling away. Also sounds very nice. Or we can do building up. Again, very, very nice. And it gives you a slightly different feel and a slightly different musical intention and meaning as to what's going on. On the falling away, we're emphasizing the one of each beat, if you like. Dugga, 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 dugga. But if we're building up in this way, it's a slightly different intention. It's building up to the beat instead of dropping away from it. So it's dunka da 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 da. It's kind of pushing us forward. It's a very different thing, and you've got to be really intentional about the way that you're using velocities, because this is what it's all about. This is where you get, a lot of the musicality and the interpretation of the part that you've put in is coming out through these tweaks. Which brings us to the next part, and that's tip 4, and that is, what about ghost notes? Now, most obviously you have ghost notes on the snare, but you have them on any drums, but you also do get them in orchestral instruments as well. But let's look at them in the snare as we're here for now. And what we're going to do is we're going to just have the 2 and 4. We're going to put them really low down like this, and we're going to use those as little ghost notes. Or it could just be something like that. It could be that you have a pattern like this. And those little extra ghost notes in between are really, really key to the kind of groove of the part. Now, if I pull them down a bit more, they're just becoming a little bit too quiet here because it's quite a wide dynamic range on this snare. Yeah, not quite working. If we had a quieter accented beat, it would work. But it's being blasted out by the accented part, by the kind of, if you like, the audible non-ghost or the visual non-ghost part. So that's another consideration, is the relative dynamic between the ghost note and the key note, if you know what I mean. What about on orchestral instruments like the violin or the trumpet? Well, so let's take our virtuoso soloist from the solo strings, and let's do some little pickup ghost notes in a pattern here. Okay, so I've got it roughly programmed right. Let's just bring that onto the beat. Let's give it a little bit of quantization, but we'll just pull the strength right down. Let's just pull it slightly closer to the beat. Now let's look at what we've got so far. Okay, so you get the idea. Now, the way that I've played it in, and obviously you can't really play in ghost notes unless you have a very, very sensitive keyboard and you're an exceptionally good keyboard player. It's much, much easier to kind of get them roughly right and then kind of tweak to taste. So let's try that. Okay, wrong way around those ones. In fact, we'll leave that there. Give that one a little bit more strength, so it's like the end note. And we could pull these even lower. So let's pull these ghost notes right down. Down, down, down. Sounding good. That was an anomaly there. Let's pull that down so it falls away. Okay, so as you can see, you can use the ghost note concept with your orchestral instruments as well. I mean, obviously the snare is an orchestral instrument, but you know what I mean. The strings of woodwinds and brass, because as opposed to playing in a pattern of sixteenths where you're kind of doing your down, up, down, up, down, up. If you're doing this as a grace note, which is almost what a ghost note is to a certain extent, then all bets are off, because the player can concentrate on that in isolation, even if it's as part of a pattern. When it's not a continuous pattern, that's where it becomes incredibly hard to get these kind of gigantic differences in dynamic, because it just locks up your brain when you're trying to play a continuous pattern like that. So we looked at violin. Let's just pop up onto the trumpets. Okay, very close. Let's just give that a little bit of assistance from the quantize button. And let's have a quick listen. Right, well, as you can see, it's not quite working at the moment, and that's because these leaps are just too big. Let's pull those down a tiny bit. Make that one's a slight anomaly. That one's a slight anomaly. Let's remove that. Okay, sounds like this. Okay, some of them are disappearing a tiny bit. So let's just give them a little bit of a boost. I want it to sound kind of definite. And what I'd actually probably do here is these notes just need to be a little bit closer to give them more of a grace note feel. Because players, when they see that part, they will instinctively play these, maybe not quite so much at the end where it's more of a 16th pattern, but they will instinctively play them slightly closer to the destination note, just because it's slightly easier if you're going ka-tung, ka-tung, ka-tung. It's harder to be metronomic, ka-tung, ka-tung, you know. And in which case we can pull that down again. And that could be ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-da. Could be. But actually ba-dum, ba-ba-ba-ba would probably sound better. So if we go back to our original quantization of these, whoopsie daisy, if we move those back onto the grid, and I think I would probably, now that we're back into a pattern, we probably need to be a little bit more even, and we could even do a little bit of a grower here at the end for our trumpet. And as she's about to embark on this final phrase, maybe this one wouldn't be quite as weak. Let's try that. Okay, I'm getting carried away. We're also using the atu, which makes it even harder because these players are desperately trying to keep in lock with each other. But actually, why don't we put this on the on the single player and check out what it sounds like. Okay, a lot clearer and a lot more defined. Something to consider and think about when you're writing these parts. However, I think that demonstrates quite clearly our kind of ghost notes idea, our 16th programming. When we're doing these ghost notes, again, you can tighten them up. You can have the slightly wider ranges in the velocities. But as you go into a more steady pattern, it all evens out again for the brass, and it becomes more of a kind of continuous and much less variable line of velocities. So turning this into a crazy tritone takes us to our fifth little tip on velocity programming, and that is doing builds and doing builds in pairs. Now, for this kind of thing where you've got the orchestra all growing through a kind of pattern of everyone's stepping up, how do you program that stuff? Do you program it as a straight line? Do you program it as, the normal kind of way we've been looking at things with the drop on the twos? Well, I have a theory about how this works best. If we put a straight line in, it sounds like this. Not too bad. But actually, I like to put things in pairs. So if I show you exactly what I mean, let's look at this. Now, I'm not dipping because I don't want to drop the power for the second part of each pair. But if I add to that on the strings, let's pick an ensemble patch, and I'll just quickly whack a part in. It's a mix roughly the same. Okay, so let's just tighten that up a tiny bit. And let's again do straight line. Sounds kind of weird. Let's do our pairs and solo. Now I might tweak that a tiny bit to get an accent on the first note. And let's add in some woodwinds. Okay, so let's have a listen to our woodwinds. I'm just going to even these out a tiny bit and do them in pairs. Okay, starting to sound good. Let's add in some low strings going down. A little bit uneven. Okay, so you get the idea. What I'm doing is I'm stepping them in pairs. Now, my thinking behind this is that it's very, very hard for a player to do a very even and gradual increase across a fast-moving passage. It tends to be groups of notes that you're thinking about, and you gradually get louder over groups of notes. It's slightly cod science, so I'm sure that if I analyse this in depth scientifically, I might find out that I'm totally wrong. But it's my experience from playing in groups and from just the way that I've observed when I've written things and I've expected it to come out a certain way and it hasn't come out a certain way, and I kind of think, why is that? And I realise that I'm placing a kind of unreasonable expectation on a group of players to play a certain thing in a way that's kind of awkward to think about and awkward musically to play. So if we did the straight line theory across everything that we're looking at here, and we just went in and straight lined absolutely everything in a perfectly balanced and even line, it would sound like this. And it doesn't sound right. Now, I know I'm exaggerating slightly, but my theory again is you have to think about the way that these instruments are being played, and you have to think about what the player is going to find comfortable and logical to do. And stepping up in groups, it might be if it's a long phrase and it's I mean, even the way I just do that, you hear it, groups of four. It's the way that your brain works. We have to subdivide things to be able to get through them. We have to kind of make patterns of things to be able to, to make sense of them. And so I would think about that as well when you're programming your velocities. Now, I hope that some of that was interesting and useful to take away and use in your own tracks. Do dig into this stuff. I always find that these tiny little percentages here and there, these little tweaks that you make as you go through and as you refine things, they all add up to a really, really significant chunk when you get to the end. And you might think, oh, I can't be bothered with that. That's too much grief. But actually what you're going to end up with is so much more satisfying and so much more musical if you put these pieces of consideration in as you go along. Thanks very much. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye-bye.